Welcome. In this class, we're going to explore how to create a peak pose class, a peak pose sequence. And the peak pose sequence is going to be, in my opinion, one of the methods that we as yoga teachers use as a foundation. It's a foundation sequence for all other sequencing, at least for the ones that we will explore together. So if you think about how a class works and goes, let's call this the anatomy of a yoga class. So you'll come into a yoga class and you'll set up your mat, you'll find the seated, laying down, or whatever is that your teacher tells you to position. And we'll have that of an opening of welcome, and today we're going to explore this or that. That's optional too if the teacher decides to tell you a little bit about what you're going to do. So there is always kind of like an opening in as we enter a yoga class. After that opening, you're going to have a warm-up. After the warm-up, there is like a center, or I call it the body of the class, that is about most possible preparation poses that eventually it would lead you to the peak pose. So when we think about a peak pose class, you think about a mountain. And so you have the opening, you have the warm-up, you have the body of the class, and think about 3/4 into class, you'll have the peak pose or a set of peak poses. It could be a set of 3 peak poses. And then after, the class will take you slowly into counter poses. So poses that are the opposite, or something almost like the opposite, doesn't have to be completely the opposite. But after that counter aspects, then you'll have the cool down. So just as you climbed up that mountain, then you start to descend, starting to cool down to find Shavasana, and at the end you can have a little meditation or a breath work, or as well there is moments to have something that the students can take away. So you can have a closing where there is some sort of small mini lecture at the end of the class. And then finally the students will leave. So we have to understand this anatomy and how it works. So when you start to create a peak pose class, one of the first things you have to consider is what is the peak pose that you're going to choose. So if, for example, let's say you're going to take Ustrasana, the camel pose, you have to think about what are the components of this pose. What are the components that build this pose? What are the main physical movements and placement of the body that requires this asana? So if you think of Ustrasana requires of a deep hip extension, it requires a whole back extension, and it requires shoulder extension as well. So with that in mind, you can start to journal. Let's say, okay, you have Ustrasana. These are the 3 main components that I need to prepare and warm up the body. So when you have those in mind, you isolate these aspects throughout the class so that you can have more success, or students can find success in achieving this peak pose. Okay, in this case, in the example let's use is Ustrasana. So once you have that idea, then you can, in the warm-up, think about a characteristic of a warm-up. A characteristic of the warm-up is that you want to create heat, right? And that you want the heart pumping. So you already can think about movements that are shorter holds. You can find repetition. You can have, very important that the warm-up are simple movements. In the warm-up, you don't, it's not so effective that in the warm-up you do a split, in a warm-up you do a headstand, because it's a lot going on. So we have to create simple movements and simple poses, and that they are dynamic. So you want more movement based. So let's say more flow stuff, like a sun salutation, maybe just like a dynamic lunge, for example, where you are in a slow lunge into a half split or something like that. So you want to have these movement-based simple poses for shorter holds to increase heat, to increase the heart rate. And so already you can add elements, simple elements that have to do with those three components, main components that, for example, we're using Ustrasana. So if you're thinking of hip extension and back extension and shoulder extension, then an example for a warm-up can be a Coda flow. So there's just one element that I'm telling you here, but it could be something like this. So we come up in a Coda and we lower it down. So this is simple, movement-based, dynamic, shorter holds, okay? So you can add many of these type of exercises that will help us to warm up these already required components. So then you have to journal what can be these possible elements for your warm-up. When you think about the body of the class are going to be the preparatory poses. So preparatory poses are just poses that are simpler, very important, simpler than your peak pose. And these can be held for longer, but they can be more complex than the ones used in the warm-up. So you're adding up a little more challenge. So, but still, this has to go along with the three components that we're working in our example of Ustrasana. So if you think about, okay, I need to do hip extension, back extension, and shoulder extension. So what can help me? Well, you could do a prep pose. This could be an Anjaneyasana, low lunge, hip extension, back extension, shoulder extension. So you can do this one and hold it for about 5 to 7 breaths. Then you switch sides. Other poses that you could do could be a warrior one in that same manner. Hip extension, back extension, shoulder extension, and so on. So always with that idea of those three components. It doesn't mean that you have to use poses that require the three of them at the same time. It doesn't have to be like that. It can be completely isolated movements. So for example, you could do Virasana, where you're not really looking to have a back extension. And so you can isolate and find poses that will help you prepare these body parts needed for the peak pose. So that is a preparatory poses, or what we call the body of the class. So 3/4 into the class, you will introduce Ustrasana. So either, if it's a new class, it all depends who's your audience, but later on that, you can repeat the peak pose maybe a couple or 3 times. I find it to be super effective for the students to understand what is the body positioning and the movements required for the peak posing. Now, once you're done with the peak pose, you have to think about counter poses. A way of thinking of counter poses is the opposite movements that you just did for asana. So because when we can think about that there are positive and negative effects of poses. So the positive ones, let's call it in Ustrasana, is that your buttock is going to tone, you're going to get strong on your back muscles, you're going to get strong in your shoulders, and so and so. But the negative effect is that your body gets tired. So your back might get tired, your legs might get tired. So you have to think about, okay, what are the elements, what are the body parts in my peak pose that are getting tired so that I can counteract that. And so the whole point of counterposing is that you bring the body back into its neutral shape, okay? So, because if not, you'll end up class like always with the heart out, which that's okay, but not overdoing it. So something that could help as a counter for Ustrasana might be a child's pose, maybe some core work, because the belly stretches a lot when you do Ustrasana. So something that engages your core, a camel pose, right, Ustrasana. So counter poses, and it's important that you do your own class so that you can feel these effects on your whole body. As well, it's important that you develop observation skills so that you can see what are the students going through as you're teaching your own sequence. So if you may feel like people are panting because they're tired, or they like moaning or complaints. So it's important that you read your class and know when is an appropriate time to bring in a counter pose. So people get tired, we'll take them in a child's pose. Unless that's part of your objective, right? So you gotta play with it. So when you go into the cool down are poses, simple poses again. So now that you went into peak, it's important that the counter are also simpler than the peak. And as you're going down, more simple stuff comes. So you can do things in the floor, for example, windshield wipers, or you can just take bound angle, butterfly legs, and just breathe with the heart. So things that bring the body back into a cool down, more slower, more passive, static, and simple. And finally, then you'll find the Shavasana. So that's a simple way of breaking down the class. So if time-wise, it's important that you think about time-wise. So time-wise, let's say, is super important because you have to think about, let's use the example of an hour class. If you think about that the peak pose is 3/4 in, then in an hour class, the Ustrasana, you might have to be doing it around 40 minutes. So you have all that time. This is also might depend on how complex is your pose, because some poses, and depending on the students, require more warm-up than others, more elements, more components, more complexities. So that's going to depend too, and as well on your students. So things to consider, but generally think about half to 3/4 into class, you have to introduce your peak pose. So if you have centering, you have opening, think about 5 minutes or so when you're doing that. Then 15 minutes or so for warm-up. 20-25 minutes for the body of the class, including the peak pose. And then 10 minutes for counter and cool down for 5 minutes of Shavasana. And the closing might be about 3 to 5 minutes. So just an example of how an hour class can go, okay? And so other questions here from your worksheet, your workbook on the worksheet page, other elements here that we have to think about is, what are the difficulties of the pose? How are you going to address that? So what are difficulties in this pose, in Ustrasana? What you may encounter is that people struggle with reaching their hands to the feet, either with the toes uncurled or curled. So with the difficulties is so that you're ready to different scenarios that you may encounter. It might be a shoulder issue too. It might be a toe issue, and so you have to come ready with different regressions. What this means is modifications, so that you are prepared, and so you are ready to give the students any modification needed. So if, for example, the students not reaching the hands towards the feet, then you can use these modifications. So this is kind of like part of your homework of researching. So what can be a regression for Ustrasana? It might be with the blocks there. If this is so hot, then you can just keep them here. So if the knee is too intense on the floor, then you have to consider how you're going to pat the knees. So little things that you're going to be ready, and that's just going to give you, your students are going to see you as an authority because you know what you're doing. So what will you use drills outside of yoga class? If so, which ones and why? So there are drills that you can use, like mobility drills that you can do. And why will you use them? Because everything that you're going to set in this sequence is hopefully purposeful, that everything is intentional. Everything that you have created has intention, and that makes a big difference. And so you can bring other things from gymnastics, from mobility, from other things that you might think it can help the students, because at the end of the day, what you're doing as a yoga teacher is to help people. So what are the best ways that you can help people is maybe bring in other elements too. So if you do a demonstration, there are different kinds of demonstration. The demonstration that I refer in this case is going to be the demonstration where you stop the class and tell the students to come and see you. So when you're introducing a new class to students, a new pose to students, it's effective that you stop them and explain them how to do the pose and how to enter the pose, what do you do in the pose, and how you exit that pose. As well as you can add in a demonstration what can be the modification that they may use. So, but you don't want to overdo it. You want to be very concise, precise, straight to the point, and because if not, people start to cool down. And so you have to consider if you're going to demonstrate the pose to the students so that then you can take them into that pose. And after, you want to consider the details, like you have to add yourself into it. You like to chant something in the end or at the beginning of the class. Will you use music? Will you have incense, or are you using aromatherapy? Are you making partner work? Are you using adjusting? Will you use that? So anything, any other detail or element, is important that you put this down and consider what are going to be these details. So once you have all that brainstorm, warm up, the components, the preps, then you have to organize them from, if we're thinking of that mountain, from simple to more complex, and from complex to simplicity. Okay, so adding poses from simple to complex as you reach that peak, and then from complex to simple as you find Shavasana. And once you have that going on, then you have to think about what are going to be the best transitions that go through your class. So because you want to, it's nice when you go to class and suddenly you're facing up and then suddenly you're standing up. So you really want to find smooth transitions throughout your practice. It's not that it's choppy. So everybody come up, sit down, come up and stand up. So especially, this is more characteristic of a flow class, right? That you're slowly transitioning into different poses. So then, after you've created that simple to complex, complex to simple, then you think about what are these transitions? How are they going to be fun? Are they going to be a little crazy, or just simple stuff? But then you start to consider your transitions. And finally, you have to think about, okay, what am I going to focus in the opening or in the closing of the class? Is there going to be a takeaway? Am I going to bring a quote? Am I going to bring a meditation or a breath work? In the beginning or in the end, it doesn't matter, or whatever you want. But then you have to think about these elements. And so start to plan. Remember that your mat is your laboratory. So create and do your shapes and your things in the mat, feel it in your body, and then start to share your sequence to your students. And let me know how that goes. Thank you so much. I hope this helps, and I'll see you next time for next sequencing class.